Welcome back to part 3. We're going to look more now at disambiguating the question. So what is the meaning of life? Sometimes thought to not be a clear question. So let's try and make it clear. So like I mentioned earlier, many philosophers don't like it. And that's in part because they think it's unclear or ambiguous, that it's not actually asking anything clear or sometimes even worthwhile. They think, well, life is meaningless, so let's move on. Or they think, well, what does that even mean? Why are we wasting time about this? Let's talk about chairs and tables and things like that. Some people are like that. And if you've done any of the reading here, especially the Susan Wilf paper, but also some of the other readings, you'll find that a lot of discussions actually start off by trying to disambiguate the question. Partly because philosophers nowadays want to focus on meaningfulness, and they want to make clear that when they're asking what is the meaning of life, they're focused on meaningfulness, and meaningfulness being a feature or aspect of life that certain lives can have. The thought here is, okay, if we're going to do that, we have to identify and set aside other possible meanings to the question meanings of the question that you might have. So a common one is perhaps to think about is when you say, what is the meaning of life? You might be asking, what is the purpose of life? So sometimes when we think about meaning, we think about, the particular purpose a thing has. So when you've thought about the meaning of your life, you might have thought, well, what should I be doing? What should I be aiming towards? What kind of activities should I do? Like, should I be engaged in an intergalactic quest for cosmic justice? Or should I just, play Scrabble with my friends? What is the purpose of my life? I'm jumping a little bit ahead there because you might have also worried about not just the purpose of your own life, but the purpose of life in general. You might wonder, well, why do human beings exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there, consciousness? And, why do we have all these thoughts and feelings about various things? Why? What was the point of all of this? What's the purpose? Sometimes talking of purpose is the thing that draws people towards, religion and, things which offer answers to these kinds of big questions. So when you think of what is the purpose of life, that is really asking a general question about life. And it's really asking about the purpose of all life. And that could be all life across the universe. I mean, we know about human life and animal life and insect life and aquatic life on the planet Earth, but there might be distant planets with other lives. And those other sentient beings might have a purpose to their lives, like we have a purpose to our lives, and all life might share a common purpose. More narrowly, people might think about the purpose to human life. What is the point of there being humans and things like this? What is the point of there being humans? And beyond this more general question, you might think of what is the purpose of my life? Like I said, you might worry about whether you should be engaged in a sort of intergalactic conflict for cosmic justice, or whether you should just play Scrabble with your friends, because maybe the purpose of your life is just to play Scrabble, and you need to figure that out. It's possible. So this asks a more specific question about us. What is the purpose of life is asking a very general, broad question about why is there, particular organisms, why is there life at all? Does that have a reason? Does that have a purpose? When you think about the purpose of your life, your own life, just as you're thinking about the purpose of life in general, you're still thinking about, something that has a goal or a true project. You might be thinking, like I say, quest for intergalactic justice, playing Scrabble with friends. That might be the thing you should be doing, one of those two comparable options. So Susan Wilf, in the reading that's assigned for this lecture and the second lecture, calls this the meaning to life question. She doesn't disambiguate it and is just as much as I do, I don't think, but either way, she still wants to identify a question which talks about whether there's a meaning to life or to lives in general. What she's interested in, though, is meaning of life. Before we skip ahead to that, get ahead to that, sometimes this talk of meaning as purpose might require the truth of what's called supernaturalism. So supernaturalism is a very broad term for anything that involves God, any kind of gods, deities, anything. So it could be the Abrahamic God of the religions of like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, or it could be a pantheistic God, like the earth is God, or it could be an animist God where trees and trees and waterfalls and other things like that are all divine beings. It doesn't matter. Supernaturalism just means that there's something beyond the human realm. Most commonly, people think about God here. So meaning is a purpose. If you think there's a meaning to life in general or your particular life, or a purpose to your life in general or your particular life, this would make sense if God exists, you know, all loving, all powerful, and all knowing God exists. Then that kind of being might have a plan for human life in general and for you in particular. So God has a plan for us, then we would have a purpose. Of course, here, supernaturalism might be false. Some of you might be religious, some of you might not, some of you might be have supernatural beliefs of some kind, whether it's God or gods or anything like that. But you know, it might well be that it's false. And we're not going to talk to any more about God so much here, at least not directly. So if you want to know more about whether God exists or not, look at the arguments for or against the existence of God. Now, if you want to have meaning as a purpose, it does seem like you have to argue for supernaturalism, and then that means arguing for the existence of God or other kinds of divine or supernatural beings. I'm going to set that question aside now. So most naturalists, and naturalism is a term that's defined in many different ways in many different debates in philosophy, but here we're just going to define it as the opposite of supernaturalism. So if supernaturalism is about believing that there are divine beings, God or gods or anything like that, naturalists just don't think there's anything like that. It's just the natural world. So most naturalists will deny there's such a thing as purpose to life in general. And that just doesn't make any sense. That's why some people don't want to talk about meaning in life as a philosophical question, because they think it's obviously true that there's no purpose to life. So we shouldn't ask about meaning in life. But some naturalists think that there could well be purpose to particular lives. So one way of arguing for this would be to use the function argument from Aristotle, from which you covered in section 1, what is good. And I won't go into too much detail here, but if your thought is that if your human beings have particular functions, if you as a person have a particular function, a particular way of being that you should aim towards, then your life in itself might have a particular purpose. That's one possible answer to the purpose question. So one I'm going to set aside now and then focus on the question of meaningfulness. So we've disambiguated one sense of the question. Now we're going to look at another sense of the question. So when I ask, what is the meaning of life? We might be thinking about meaningfulness, having a sense of meaning in life, like meaningfulness, the sense that some things are important or significant or important, or maybe it means something else. And we might then ask, well, what are meaningful lives like? You might think, we can imagine particular cases or particular examples where someone has a meaningful life. We might imagine other examples where somebody has a meaningless life. You might also wonder then, well, can lives be meaningful? Actual human lives. We might be able to imagine hypothetical cases of people who have meaningful lives, but they're just purely hypothetical cases. And real humans can't actually access this kind of meaning. So that's another question that might follow on from this one disambiguation here. So let's focus on the question of what are meaningful lives like? And this question has been the focus of most philosophical discussions. And the methodology used in many of these discussions is to appeal to cases and people's intuitions or judgments about cases. The general strategy here is to look at particular examples and say, this person has a meaningless life, this person has a meaningful life, or this person has a less meaningful life than this other person, or this person has a more meaningful life than this other person. All depends on our intuitive reactions or intuitive judgments or intuitions about these cases. And one main example that's been used in the recent literature is due to Susan Wolf, and that is in the reading for this lecture. But let me read it here for you now. So this is the case of Blob. So Wolf says, for me, the ideal the idea of a meaningless life is most clearly and effectively embodied in the image of a person who spends day after day or night after night in front of a television set, drinking beer and watching situation comedies. Not that I have anything against television or beer. Still, the image, understood as an image of a person whose life is lived in hazy passivity, a life lived at an not unpleasant level of consciousness, but unconnected to anyone or anything, going nowhere, achieving nothing, is, I submit, as strong an image of a meaningless life as there can be. Call this the case of the blob. So then we might imagine, well, there's a case of a meaningless life. Can we compare this to meaningful lives? So we might think of Mahatma Gandhi, Albert Schweitzer, Mother Teresa, Albert Einstein, Jonas Salk, Cezanne, Harriet Tubman, Beethoven, Charlie Parker, Paul Gauguin, Che Guevara, Winston Churchill, Marie Curie, Roman Polanski, Charles Darwin, Frida Kahlo, Nelson Mandela, Monet, Mozart, Martin Luther King, and perhaps even yourself. We might look at all these lives and think these are all meaningful in comparison to Blob, who clearly has a paradigm meaningless existence. So Woolf claims that Blob's life is the paradigm meaningless existence. So Blob's life has just no meaning. She thinks that that is a clear case of a person whose life has zero meaning. So while Woolf wants to say his life is meaningless, a weaker claim she could have made here is to say that Bob's life is less meaningful than other lives. Maybe there's still some meaning to be had, but it's less meaningful. This might be important in the second collaborative class where we look at Antti Kaupinen's paper. But at the moment, note that Woolf herself makes the stronger claim that Blob has a meaningless life. But if you wanted to object to that and say his life does have some meaning, then perhaps you can pull back to the weaker claim and say, well, his life is still much less meaningful than everyone else's. And that's clear when we compare Blob to people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, Mozart, Harriet Tubman, Nelson Mandela, and so on. So like I mentioned before, the methodology here is to appeal to our judgments or intuitions about meaningfulness. And these tell us which lives are meaningful and what meaningfulness consists of, or they point us in the direction. So we look at Gandhi and think he has a meaningful life. What's his life like? And we can try and draw out from that what meaningfulness involves. And we look at Blob, his life is meaningless, and we can try and figure out what's missing from his life in comparison to someone like Gandhi. What is it about that, his case, that makes him meaningless but Gandhi meaningful? The question is here, well, what is meaningfulness? So quite common in the literature here is to distinguish meaningfulness from things like happiness and rightness. The thought here is that you can have a meaningful life despite not being happy. You might have struggled for social justice, for civil rights, for some important cause, but have been very upset in doing it. Now, you were doing something right there, but you might have been a torturous life full of struggle and toil, but your life might still have been meaningful. Now, many people will say that meaningfulness is not about rightness. So an artist like Paul Gauguin, he made great works of art, but he didn't do things which were right in the sense of being morally right. He did many morally bad things. So meaningfulness here is not supposed to be the same as being morally right or being a morally perfect person. The person with a perfectly meaningful life or a very meaningful life doesn't have to be a perfectly moral person. Think back here to Susan Wolf's Moral Saints. There's a little bit of overlap in what she's thinking about here. So for Wolf, meaningfulness is a separate category to happiness and rightness, and that's very much shared, a very much shared assumption in the literature about meaning in life. I don't know if everyone agrees with that, but it's commonly held. So the take-home message here is a meaningful life need not be a happy or a morally virtuous life. What about views about the meaning of life? So we're going to go back to these views in more detail in different lectures. So one view is objectivism. So according to the objectivist about meaning in life, there are mind-independent facts about what meaningfulness is. To say it's mind-independent is just to say that a life is meaningful or not meaningful doesn't depend on humans existing. That is just true or false, independent of any humans existing. So if you thought that meaning in life required engaging in a particular activity, giving to charity, let's say, that's just going to be true independently of there being humans. It's something that's just out there. And when we're thinking about what a meaningful life is, we're trying to access this mind independent fact and go, yeah, I figured out what I should do with my life. I should give to charity because it's an objective fact that that's what a meaningful life involves. So views of the meaning of objectivist views include being part of an organic unity beyond oneself. And the philosopher Robert Nozick defends this kind of view. The thought here is that you just want to be part of something bigger than yourself. This might include being religious, or part of a cult, or part of a gang, part of a nation, part of a community, part of a family. It just has to be something bigger than you. Like that's part of what that's how we get meaningfulness in life, is being part of this bigger thing. Or it might be being creative. So Taylor here thinks, meaning in life is all about being creative. We have to be creative, create things. In particular, what's going to make it objectivist rather than subjectivist is that you're going to be creative in particular directions. There's particular things you should be creative. You should be creative in how you murder people, but be creative in creating excellent works of art. And, that kind of thing. Or it might be that meaningfulness comes from promoting good consequences. So the utilitarian philosopher Peter Singer endorses this view, thinks that you get meaningfulness from giving as much money as you can to charity and trying to help save everyone. And that's where you'll get meaning in life. Right. So like I said, on this view, when we're having judgments about meaningfulness, they're tracking these mind-independent facts. So the subjectivist, on the other hand, thinks that meaningfulness varies from person to person. So most subjectivists, they don't think that meaning is just anything you choose, but rather it's to do with, for example, caring or loving. So Harry Frankfurt, he thinks that meaningfulness comes from caring about things and loving things and being engaged in relationships and really valuing things for themselves. Now, this is a subjectivist view because he doesn't think that we should care or love particular things. We just should be engaged in the activity of caring and loving. We might love things which are terrible, really bad for us, or things which don't really seem to merit being cared for or loved, but we still get a meaningful life because we're engaged in that process of caring or loving. So a more extreme view would be here the view of Jean-Paul Sartre, which is that it be whatever you choose. You have to determine your own meaning. You have to figure it out for yourself and do that all yourself. So the caring or loving is a form of what you might think of as the fulfillment view. Through caring and loving for people, you can help fulfill yourself and make yourself feel good. There are various versions of this view, but Frankfurt's is one of them. And Sartre's view is existentialist. He is an existentialist. I'm no expert in existentialism, and there's a lot going on in existentialism, but a key part of it is this idea about radical freedom, at least in Sartre's version of it. And so part of that is that you can really make meaning for yourself and really choose. Life is otherwise meaningless, but we can really make this meaning. So it seems to be an implication of the existentialist view is that you have the power to determine what's meaningful. Like that's something that you have. You have to really make the meaning. Whereas the fulfillment view doesn't really allow that. The fulfillment view doesn't say that you have the power to determine what's meaningful, but you can get meaning for yourself by caring and loving for things. It's through caring or loving that you get meaning, and not through just deciding that you're going to get meaning from some random activity. So here with the fulfillment view, it's rather about attitudes being satisfied. If our attitudes, like our cares or love for people, are aiming towards something, like having fulfilling relationships or that kind of thing, then if those attitudes are fulfilled and we can care for people and we can love people, then we get this meaningfulness in life. So one of the views we're going to focus the most on is that kind of hybrid view. So hybrid view tries to combine what's good about subjectivist and objectivist views. So the strategy here is to take some of the subjectivist suggestions and argue that some are objectively valuable. These, in so doing, these are really objectivist views because they ultimately say there's objective facts about what makes a life meaningful or what makes a life meaningless. But the important thing is, in comparison to sort of classic objectivist views, there's a very important subjective component. So we're going to consider Susan Wolf's version of this view in lecture 2, but as a bit of a preview. She defends what's called the fitting fulfillment view. So like Frankfurt, she believes that you have this subjective component of fulfillment, but she thinks that you have to, be fulfilled by the right kinds of things. There are things that you could be fulfilled by which will not make your life meaningful. So a final view is nihilism or pessimism. So on one version of this view, it's possible to have a meaningful life. It's possible in some sense of possible, but human beings ourselves, we can't have them. We're just not the right kinds of beings to have meaningful lives. God perhaps has a meaningful life, but poor old humans don't. For one example, one reason, maybe we're mortal and death destroys all meaning that we might have had if we'd lived forever. On another version of nihilism or pessimism, there's no such thing as a meaningful life. So we can't have a meaningful life because no one can. Life and existence is inherently meaningful. Sometimes it's inherently meaningless, and as some say, absurd. And one version of this view is that existence is extrinsically harmful, and that's defended by the philosopher David Benatar. So he thinks that there's a harm of coming into existence, and that makes life meaningless. More well known is the French existentialist Albert Camus, thinks that life is absurd. And he thinks that there's no meaning to life. Life is just absurd, and we have to just embrace that. So that gets us to the end of the first lecture. I hope you're raring to go for more talk about meaning in life. I know I certainly am. And then in the next lecture, we're going to be talking about Susan Wolf's view, worthwhile activities. Before that, you're going to be having the first collaborative class on free will and meaning. So I'll see you in my recorded form back for that.